Hi, everyone. Today we'll be doing our overview of the middle years American social thought. So, when we talk about the middle years, we're looking at 1930 to the mid late 1970s. And when we're getting to the American social thought during these years, we're looking at how the Americans are starting a new theoretical thread. So rather than continuing the ideas of the classical theorist, they are reacting against the classical theorist. And in addition, rather than continuing ideas of popular psychological theories of that time, they're reacting against those ideas. And we'll talk about both of those reactions on the next couple slides. But overall, we can recognize that the middle year American social thought thread eventually evolves into what we call today as symbolic interactionism. We can look at how they're starting a new thread of theory by looking at how they were reacting against the classical theorist in Europe. So we looked at some of these classical theorists. We started with Marx, then moved to Durkheim, Weber, and Simmel. So the American social thought was reacting against these individuals and their theories. And one reaction is that shift away from looking at structural forces and how structural forces shape life to emphasizing how agency and free will also shape our realities. And then the other shift is away from that top down macro directional approach to explaining life to a more micro oriented bottom up directional approach when it comes to explaining the social world. In addition to reacting against the classical theorist in Europe, the American social thought theorists were also reacting against popular psychological theories at that time. Theories such as Freudian thought and behaviorism. And again, we can see two different kind of shifts here. First, shifting away from Freudian thought, they're focusing less on unconscious drives behind action to more of a focus on how individuals are aware of what they do and why they are doing it. And then we see a second shift away from behaviorism by de emphasizing one's automatic responses behind action. So just simply reacting unconsciously without thought to a stimulus, to now focusing more on how individuals make their own decisions and how those decisions, those deliberations, actually are what's behind kind of what we do and why we do it. To conclude this overview, we can remind ourselves of the four different pieces we read in this section of the class. We started by looking at Cooley and Mead, and we see their focus on self-development. Cooley looking at the looking glass self, how primary or secondary groups influence our self-development. With Mead, we looked at how the concepts of the I and the me work together to create one's self-development. And then we turned our attention to the Adlers, who represent the legacy of Cooley and Mead. And we see their focus on self-change. So how those athletes, when getting feedback from people, when getting feedback from the media, start to change their identities, start to change their senses of self. And then we looked at Du Bois, like Cooley and Mead. His focus was on self-development, specifically the development of the second sense of self, the double consciousness, based upon the feedback African Americans were receiving during this middle year time period. And then we finished this section of the class with Goffman's book, Stigma. And Goffman, like the Adlers, representing the legacy of Cooley and Mead. As I mentioned before, Goffman is kind of at the intersection of the middle years and contemporary thought. But nevertheless, we can say that Goffman has a focus on self-presentation, so how we present ourselves according to the situation in which we find ourselves. So common themes in the American social thought thread. Again, the focus on agency. We can see in all four of the pieces, being aware of the role you're in and having to play out that role. For Mead, being aware of the new forms of feedback and how you are changing your sense of self in the Adlers. Being aware of how other people see you, the stigma that they impose upon you. You see that idea in both Du Bois and in Goffman's piece as well. And in Goffman, you kind of see the idea of agency through the ability to kind of choose your stigma management. So you can choose your stigma management, but you can't choose being normal or not. And so you see agency being a common thread throughout all four of those pieces. And then again, when focusing on self-development, self-change, self-development, self-presentation, we're focusing on that micro level, looking at individuals, individual thoughts, individual actions. Then again, with all four, there's an emphasis on the role of psychological tension in constructing the realities under examination. So, it doesn't matter if they're focusing on self-development, self-change, or self-presentation. Psychological tension is a driving force in all those examinations. So we'll leave that there for now. A nice, short and sweet overview of the middle years, American social thought. And so our next presentation is going to turn our attention to a European social thought during the same time period during the middle years, specifically with a focus on neo-Marxism.